And the Reading League Michigan just welcomes you, Dr. Kovelman. And I want to add too, in addition to your official biography that we just read, I just want to add what a delight you are. I stumbled upon Ioulia when I went to San Diego. So I was going to the summit that the Reading League hosted, and it was about multilingual learners, bilingual learners, and they presented Ioulia Kovelman from Michigan. And I thought, what? She's from Michigan? And such a delight. Her passion, besides brilliant, she's doing incredible work. The University of Michigan in her lab offers free, actually, they pay you to bring your students in and get assessment through their lab. Her assistants, everyone in the lab is authentic, kind, passionate, urgent. They have an urgency about our students, not only in our state, but in this country. So I put her on a pedestal not only for her intelligence and what she's bringing to the field, but her humanity and the people that she brings alongside her. So the gift that we have this evening to be here, I can't put the words on it. And with that, I just turn the stage over to this platform over to the amazing Dr. Kovelman.
Rebecca, your words are too kind. I'm a petri dish scientist. I sit in the basement and look at kids' brains. I am not in the classroom. I am not teaching teachers. I'm not with teachers. So I cherish every opportunity to actually be in an educational context and with educators because there's no point in me talking to myself looking at the brain pictures. I'll show you some really cool brain pictures. Don't get me wrong, the brain pictures are kind of cool. But at the end of the day, those brains are inside children's heads. And children's heads is what teachers face on a day in, day out basis. And you guys are doing all the cool work, whereas we just get to do silly things. And we crawl out of our basements thanks to Rebecca and others so that we get a bit of sun, during the winter snowy day and get to actually talk to other human beings. So with that, I will show you a little bit about what we do. And at the same time, I don't want to talk at you. So um, there'll be a chat opportunity for you guys to register your comments. And at some point I will stop and we will have a dialogue because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, I do sit in the basement. Our lab is at Rebecca has visited our lab. We really are in the basement. It's not a joke. And we're not in the School of Education. We're in the Department of Psychology. So we really do not get out that much to see either kids or teachers outside our imaging environments, and we welcome every opportunity for feedback and dialogue. So with that said, I will go ahead and share my screen so that you can take a look. So the permissions are working. I can see that. This should be fine. You should be able to see my slideshow. Can you see my slides? Yes, perfect. So we're going to talk about the bilingual brain. I am a faculty at the University of Michigan and just a little bit about what I do and why I do what I do. As you hear in my accented speech, it's Russian at the background. I'm one of the millions of people that were literally splashed out into the world as the Soviet Union collapsed now 30 years ago. And many of you have encountered bilingual, you may have thought, encountered Spanish English education because there's a lot of Spanish speakers in this country. You may have encountered French English education because French is so cool and people wanted their kids to learn French. But millions and millions of kids coming to migrate with their parents and learning to read with very little opportunities to learn to read in their heritage or home languages. And so from formal bilingual educations to very informal home conversations, we ask, what does the home language of the child bring into their language development, reading development, brain development? What influences does it have? And so with that, we'll look at how bilingual kids learn. And we're talking about reading, the reading league, but reading starts at home with spoken language. And so we'll start literally from the very beginning and work through some myths and facts of bilingual development. So if you've been doing bilingualism long enough, you would know these are the usual offenders in the discussion about bilingualism. We call them the bilingual paradox. The first one is that, well, on the one hand, it's amazing to learn languages when you're young. Because look at these kids who are speaking French, Spanish, Chinese, Hindi, whatever comes their way, without having to take all these laborious exercises and tests and exams and vocabulary drills that you probably did take your foreign language class. On the other hand, we worry, well, aren't they going to be delayed? Aren't they going to be delayed in learning how to speak compared to kids who are only learning one language? And won't they be confused? How do they know this is one language and this is the other? Wouldn't their brain get confused, their systems get confused by these two languages? So this means we're making an assumption about the brain. We're somehow assuming that the brain, the human brain, didn't really evolve for multiple languages. We're making an assumption about the brain, the way our brain is built is that it's built for one language. And that means we make implications for an educational system. We often discuss learning one language, learning to read in one language, building these foundations, then learning to read in another language, withholding a language. Which language do we start with? What if the kid has reading and language impairments? Then what, right? Is the brain even built for that? If you have a language impairment and now you have multiple languages happening, what are we doing? So, me and my colleagues are in the business of figuring out what is it are we doing? So this is what we do. That's why we're in the basement with the petri dishes, right, and the brains, trying to figure out what's about those assumptions. And I will start at the beginning where I got my training. I owe what I do and what I know to Dr. Lorianne Petito, who has recently retired from the University of Gallaudet. University of Gallaudet, if you do not know, is the university in Washington, D.C. for individuals who are deaf. And the question she was pursuing was, are we born to talk? So when children are deaf and exposed to sign language, is that an aberration, an adaptation, some sort of a way in that is otherwise unnatural for the brain development? And the way you'd ask that question is by looking at kids who are coded, children of deaf adults, because they are exposed to a sign and spoken language from birth. So they have an equal opportunity to learn their two languages. And so if we're born to talk, then speech should come first and sign should come second. If that's not the case, then they should be developing both languages at the same time. Now, who do you compare these kids to? Do you compare them to monolinguals of sign and speech? And the answer at the time was no, because we also thought that bilinguals are delayed, right? So another 20 years ago, the prevailing notion was that bilinguals are behind monolinguals in the development of language. So you want to be comparing your bilingual kids who are coded sign speech to the unimodal bilingual kids, either to sign or to spoken languages, before you answer these questions. So these are some of the papers that we published from it. I put it here in the slides in case people want to look them up later. And so the question one that we asked was, are bilingual kids delayed in learning to speak and to read? And so we're going to start by asking questions about speech. In language acquisition, if you're the person who works with babies and toddlers, you would know that about 12 months, kids produce their first word. About 18 months, they'll produce their two-word combinations, like blue ball. And at about 24 months, they'll have their 50 words. Great. What about the bilingual kids? So to answer that question, we're looking at kids exposed to two spoken language in the sign and the spoken language. This work was done in Montreal, which is actually right, Canada's on the other side of Michigan. So if you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And so in Canada, where especially Montreal, where they speak a lot of French, the bilingual control would be the French-English bilingual speakers. So let's look at the French-English bilingual kid. What you get is the first word comes at about a year and 2 months. So that's 12 to 14 months, well within the monolingual range, right? At about 12 months on average, that's when most kids produce their first words. Notice that it's within the monolingual range and also at the same time for both languages, same for the other milestones. Now, if we look at sign and speech bilingual, same thing. So this is a kid who's signing and speaks French. And you see that the first sign comes at 10 months and the first French word comes at 12 months. Same thing for other milestones. So the long story short, speech is not special, by the way, in case you missed this point, right? So speech is not special. We are wired to produce language, whatever it happens, sign or speech. We're born to talk, and we're also born to talk more than one language, right? So the kids, so a lot of these kids would have had one parent more proficient in one language and the other parent more proficient in the other language. So they're exposed to both languages very early in life. This is not delaying their language acquisition processes. So I actually, oh, here's the video. I wanted to show you the video. Can you hear it? You cannot hear it. If you're not hearing, I will skip it. I'm not sure what I needed to click to allow you to hear it. I apologize. There must be, one second, let me do that. It's in the Zoom, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share again. There's used to be a button that allowed to, oh, share sound and optimize, and now share again. Okay, great. Now it should work. Can you hear? Now you can hear.
Simone is almost 2.
Sorry.
Simone is almost 2 years old. He's signing and he's speaking. His mother is profoundly deaf and signs to him. His father is partially deaf and speaks to him in French. Simone, who has normal hearing, seems perfectly comfortable with this arrangement.
For Simone, it's very natural. He never gets frustrated with it. He doesn't really make a distinction between the hearing and the deaf. People are very surprised that he can sign. He's like a model to the world.
Simone is learning both to sign and to speak. But does he find speech more natural, easier to learn? Paula and Laura have been videotaping Simone since he was 4 months old. And here's what they've discovered. Simone is passing every major milestone in language learning, in both sign and speech, at exactly the same time. One of these milestones is putting 2 words together. Partir lolo, he says in French. The water's all gone. A few minutes later in the tape, he's putting 2 signs together. He signs monkey and then same, meaning the monkey in the room is the same as the one in the book.
It suggests.
Whoops. Okay, did I jump slides? There we go. So that, I should really have had another slide here to give you the summary, but here's the summary. So it's an old video. It was filmed before my joining the science, but I wanted to make sure that you see it, that the bilingual kids really are acquiring both of their languages. To see it is to believe it, that bilingual kids, when you have both languages available, will acquire milestones, which is essentially vocabulary and grammar in each of their languages at the same time, even when it's that amazing that it's a sign and a spoken language, right? So never mind 2 spoken languages where there's a much sort of more obvious, people say, well, they're hearing things. But here they're transferring cross modality and they're learning this. So moving on, I promised to show you some brains. Brain. I hope most of you know that language is organized in the left hemisphere. You've got 2 hemispheres over here. There's the right one and the left one. Be careful of your left hemisphere. Don't let any brick fall down on it. Wear your helmets when you ride a bicycle. You really need it, because anything happens, you will wake up and you won't be able to speak. Now, what happens is that when kids are born, there's a fair amount of equipotentiality, in a sense that the two hemispheres could potentially take the language function. In instances where kids are born with perinatal injury to the left, their right hemisphere can actually support language. But in most of us, it's the left. That's because over time, our left hemisphere becomes specialized for language. It's like over time, you get better at cooking or finger spelling or typing, whatever it is you're doing. The brain also becomes better over time, and certain parts of the brain become better at doing certain jobs. The left hemisphere becomes better at processing language than the right. And right here, right above your eyebrow on the left, there's a part of the brain, we call it Broca's area. It's right here. It's blue on this brain picture. This particular part of the brain is responsible for everything that's difficult in language. Think like grammar, complex syntax. If it's difficult, it's going to come up here for some analysis. And this part of the brain becomes progressively more left lateralized. This is a study that was done comparing kids ages 6 to 18. And so it's a comparison. So there's a left minus right, and that difference becomes bigger, bigger, and bigger over time. And I think that's just part of natural language use in biology. That's how we're wired. And what you can ask, so well, does the environment have something to do with it? And people who ask that have discovered that kids who have parents of higher SES, and we think these are the kids whose parents might be more verbal, have more books in the house, have more sort of high language availability. People have also looked at kids whose parents talk more to their children, and you find out that in these kids there actually is greater left lateralization than in other kids. And we're a bilingual lab, and we thought, well, what about bilingualism? Feels like a really good exercise for that brain muscle, right? Wouldn't that do something? And so a student in our lab did that study, and I wanted to show you, I'm showing you too many videos today, but I have to show you videos, right? You guys are teachers. You appreciate the need for sharing videos.
Are you interested in how children learn?
Can
So
you
are
still
we.
hear?
In our language and literacy project at the University of Michigan, we study how children learn to read and how their minds and brains work when reading. Our goal is to help scientists and teachers design better reading instruction to help all children become better readers. During the visit, parents complete a survey about their child. Children play reading games and learn about science and how their brain works. We look at how children's brains work during reading games using our safe and child-friendly Effner's method. Using sensors similar to those in everyday smartwatches, Effner's measures changes in how the body and brain work. Participants are paid for their time and receive information about their children's learning. Our project directors are Drs. Ioulia Kovelman, Teresa Satterfield Linares, and In Chi. Please contact us using the email address.
So that includes a description of our lab and also sort of it's also a quick ad for our studies. So in our lab, we use this optical brain imaging method, which is a band to look at how kids' brains develop. And so what we find is that children who are bilingual, a lot of the kids in our study attend, we have a partnership. Dr. Teresa Satterfield, who is a collaborator on our studies, runs she's the director of A Nuestra Lengua. It's a Saturday school for Spanish-speaking kids. They come in for about 2 to 4 hours and get some formal instruction in Spanish. It's almost like an after-school program because it's not part of the regular school day. It's a community program. Nevertheless, they're getting some regular Spanish language instruction in addition to speaking Spanish in the homes. And so we're finding that amazingly, these kids have also stronger engagement of the left frontal lobe, this part of the brain, and supports all the good stuff. It does those rhyme judgments, the phonological awareness, and we'll talk about these later if you like. But it's the part of the brain that's really essential for language analysis. And so we're seeing it as being more active in the kids who are bilingual, suggesting that bilingual is a really good exercise for brain development. So that, my friend, is on the subject of development, whether bilingualism holds language development back. And we've shown you behavioral evidence, some videos, and some brain evidence that we don't think that's the case. And the next question people ask, well, wouldn't they confuse their two languages? And this question comes up twice. It comes up when they're little, Oh, they're hearing the two languages. They don't know when one language ends and the other one begins, and they just confuse them. And so they're going to be delayed in language acquisition. And then it comes again when they learn how to read, and then it's like, oh my goodness, they're going to learn how to read in Spanish and in English. It's the same alphabet, but we read different languages. When they get confused, worse, they're learning to read in Chinese, which is characters, and they're learning to read in English, which is letters. When they get confused, right? There's always this thing about confusion when it comes to learning multiple languages discussion. And so this about the babies. If you have kids or grandkids, and you may have seen the 1-year-olds. 1-year-olds are in one word stage. They don't say blue ball yet. They go blue, and then sometimes they'll say ball, right? So one word stage. They're doing one word at a time. That's their thing at 1 years. And so you bring these delicious little things into the lab, and you ask their French-speaking mother to just chat with the kid. And this is what's happening. So the kids and so you have French-speaking mother and English-speaking father, and they came in with a mom, and they're speaking to each other. This is what the kid is producing. The kid's producing mostly French, right? So it's mostly French, but the child is producing some English. And then you say, tell the mother, thank you so much. Would you mind sitting in the corner and reading some magazines over here? And an English-speaking student comes out to play with the baby. And look at that French, it just dropped, right? So the kids are not confused. And yes, if you look at the first graph, you might actually think the kid's confused. Like, well, 1/3 of the time they're using English. But that's likely because the kid knows the mom's bilingual and she's going to be using also both languages. Maybe they heard their mom use English with their dad, so that's totally fine. But now that the mom's sitting down as a new person and only speaks English, the go-to response is to use English. On the other side, you see, remember, we're looking at children of deaf adults as well. So there's a deaf mother brings her baby. I believe the father is a traveling salesman, is not home very often. And you have the deaf mother is signing and the child is speaking French. You see how there's very little speech because the deaf mother obviously wouldn't hear French. And then again, the mother is sitting down, the French-speaking experimenter is coming up, and you see the child's dropping the sign, doesn't disappear completely, but there's a shift. So I don't think the kids are confused. You see, they are using both languages because they want to express themselves, their vocabulary is limited, but they're not confused. And this is the reading development, right? This is the next step of the discussion. This is a study we did in our lab, and this is Dr. Teresa Satterfield, the director of the Industrial Language School, and this project was part of Dr. Nilima Wagley's dissertation. She's now a professor at Arizona State University, continuing this work. So here we really wanted to understand the relation between spoken language and reading. Not surprisingly, the better the kids speak English, the better they can read in English, right? You know more vocabularies, rules of grammar, you can parse through long sentences, obviously. Again, Spanish, right? So if you give me a book in Spanish, I mean, the alphabet's the same and I can sort of get through it, but just decoding is going to get me nowhere. You have to know Spanish as a language to have reading comprehension in Spanish. Again, no surprises. What is interesting is that the word reading is one skill. These are not two different skills. These kids don't have like a ball for English word reading, the ball for, Spanish word reading. No, it's a combined enlarged set of word reading decoding skills. The same alphabet, the same phonological awareness. The phonological awareness is also the same. It's one ball of skills. It's a larger ball than that of a monolingual, but it is a ball. They are tightly interconnected. They have a wider range of word reading ability. That's what it is. And they use it for reading in English and reading in Spanish. That decoding word pattern recognition skill is more or less one enlarged set, and it supports both languages. And most importantly, the better they can do reading comprehension in Spanish, the better they can do reading comprehension in English. And how do they get to better reading comprehension in Spanish, you may ask, since they're attending English-speaking schools? Well, that is using Spanish because welcome to Michigan. I know, Rebecca, isn't this amazing? You have a bilingualism researcher in the middle of Michigan. Who knew? So yes, this means that these kids are attending English-speaking schools. Their bus is picking them up at 7:30 in the morning, drops them off at 4 p.m. at night with some more homework in English, right? So their use of Spanish is super limited. The more they use Spanish, the more books in Spanish these kids have in the home, the better is their Spanish, the better is their reading comprehension in Spanish, the more that skill can support their English. So again, they're not confused, but what's happening is that the two languages are interacting. They're growing up like twins. You have two languages, they're growing up like twins together, right? Holding hands. And some skills really are separate. English syntax is not exactly the same thing as Spanish syntax. Knowing one may not necessarily help you with the other. You have to be using that language to speak that language. At the same time, some skills are really awfully similar, like word reading. And again, you have to have decoding skills in each language, but they're formed together and they go together. It doesn't mean they're confused, right? Again, they're not confused and they're not delayed. Rather, they have this a highly transferable skill that's bidirectionally supporting the reading development for these kids. So here's some citation. They can learn more about this. And just to bring you back to the paradox of it all is that, yes, bilinguals can learn both of their languages, and these languages will come in at the same time and at the same time as monolinguals. That's in your absolutely what I think ideal. Maybe not ideal, but it is what it is, right? If you have the availability of both languages from an early life, then these are the growing milestones. If you have exposure at a later time, then that's what happens, and that language will start catching up. And if you have disbalance, then that's also going to be obvious, right? There's face validity to these things. But the question is, can the brain learn both languages without delay and aberration? The answer is absolutely. The brain is built to learn multiple languages. The kids don't get confused, they do not get delayed. And this means that with systematic instruction in each language, with the kind of instructional support that can take assets from the child's home language, the kids can become bilingual and they can become biliterate. And I have terrific colleagues who develop systematic instruction program for bilingual kids with dyslexia. Children with dyslexia who are bilingual can also become successful biliterates. It doesn't come for free. It does have to come with work, but it's not impossible, at least from the neurological perspective. Certain things are impossible because you didn't have the teachers, the teachers didn't have the instruction or the training, but it's not impossible because the brain was built against you. That is these are the findings that are occurring in our discipline. And this is exactly what we're doing. So as Rebecca has mentioned earlier, part of our research is providing kids. We actually do pay the kids to come in and get a literacy assessment with us. We do look at their brain. That's what we're for. But the kids come in and we have about 2 hours worth of standardized literacy and experimental literacy assessments. We take them through the works of phonological, morphological decoding, reading comprehension, all the things that usually come with these extensive diagnostic practices for dyslexia. We do this in our lab. We welcome kids with dyslexia, those who suspect they might have one, or just those curious to see how research is done. We always need a comparison group. So any kid or family that are interested are willing to come and participate.
Ioulia,
And
can you check and see, can you change the percentage view on your slides? Because we're not getting, does yours say is it 100%? Because we're getting of a
slide share, stop share. I see. I understand what you mean.
And I want them I wanted them to be able to see that. So I don't know if
I understand. Okay, so actually what did I do? I think I just oh, I see. Oh, let me see how I can do this. So this might be this particular screen is large, and so that the percent is getting. So we'll just have to do it this way from this point on. Otherwise, I don't know how to do it. So this is the information about our study. Can you see it? I do share the full percent. I know what you mean, but I'm not sure how I can change this.
Go ahead and just go back to your slideshow, and then I'll make sure that everyone gets that, because I have this.
You have this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So this means you're having some difficulty seeing my slides, and I apologize about that. because this is, yeah, this, I don't know, because it's a big screen, but I'm doing a slideshow, but you are just seeing this one. There's no terribly easy ways of doing this. I'm sorry about this.
Just go back to your slideshow. That's okay. I just wanted to.
Next time I will share my laptop screen and then it'll fill up the screen. I haven't thought about this. So the next question is about learning to read in what happens when you are learning to read in multiple different languages, right? So this is, let me see, this is our the last quick pointer of the day is that as you know, and you don't have to look at my slides, by the way, my friends. I think I'm more or less talking about the things that we're doing. So the magical triangle where you're connecting the word sounds, meanings, and print. So you have to connect sound, meaning, and print in order to read the word. The words have sounds and the words have meanings. We often think about meaning in terms of morphology and morphemes because every single word has at least one morpheme, right? Kind is a word and has one morpheme. Kindly is a word, now has two morphemes, and each morpheme brings its own unit of meaning. What you know about reading already is that in alphabetic languages such as English and Spanish, in order to learn how to read, you have to map sounds onto letters. There's just no way getting past that, right? So I give you a word dog, you have to do the og, and that's how it goes. In Chinese, the characters map onto morphemes. So for each morphosyllable, like kindly, you would have two different characters. And yes, inside the characters have additional units, but the big picture is that characters map onto morphemes at this lexical level. And so the question that we ask, how does that influence word reading for bilingual kids who are learning different languages, such as Spanish and Chinese? What happens? And remember, we're doing our work in Michigan. By the way, we're still in Michigan. We did not leave the state for, I don't know, Texas, right? There's plenty of bilinguals of all kind. You live in large communities. We're in Michigan. These kids get out at 7 a.m. They're still getting on that regular bus and they're going to school in Lansing or wherever you guys are at, and likely going to an all English spoken and reading environments. So morphology, just very briefly, lots of people think morphology is something the linguists came up with to confuse people. That's not the case. There's lots of good stuff. So words like lunchable, Facebookable, contactless. This is the stuff that our generation basically came up with these words, right? So the previous generation would be like, what the heck is contactless? But you know what it is. We came up with the word during COVID. It's a brand new word in English vocabulary, and nobody has a problem with it. We understand contact and we understand less. We put them together. That's how we make words. And so when kids begin to read and they encounter progressively longer words, it helps if you know morphology, because then even if you didn't know the word contactless, but then you came up with this long word and you knew the two elements, you'd be in business because you know what this is about. So it's something that we look at very carefully, and we bring in bilingual kids. They're English, Spanish bilinguals, Chinese English bilinguals, and English monolinguals. And we did a longitudinal study. We looked at them in about year 2019 and then again in 2021 with all the challenges of doing research during those COVID shutdowns. Looking at how their languages interact for reading development. And here's what we find. So at time one, we looked at in 2019, we'll look at their phonological and morphological development in both languages. And then at time two, we did the same thing. And here's what we find. The correlation, or otherwise the association or the relationship, whatever you want to call it, between phonology in, say, in Spanish and Chinese in 2019 and English phonology in 2021 is almost perfect, right? There's almost a perfect relationship between the way you know how to segment words in heritage language to how you segment words in English a year later. That makes a lot of sense. I can give you words in Russian that you do not know, and you can still segment them into sounds and syllables, because if you have the phonological segmentation skill, you can do it with words you do not know. It's a skill in and of itself, identifying the initial sounds, the final sounds, the breaking up into syllables and sounds. This is easily transferable no matter what the language is. So that's terrific. When we look at morphology, the association between morphological awareness in Spanish in 2019 and in English in 2021 is again amazing, right? So kids' knowledge of Spanish is really supporting their knowledge of English morphology. Makes perfect sense. Think of the words aquatic, right? Agua is water in Spanish. So there's plenty of words. Nation, ION, election, again, ION, right? So there's all these roots and all these morphemes. So the better the kids knew Spanish in, say, their grade 1, the better is their English morphology in grade 2. It's a perfect association. And there's very little of it between Chinese and English. Not surprising. I took Chinese for about a year, and during that whole year, I learned only one word that I could bring from Russian, never mind English, from Russian into Chinese. And that word was cha, which means chai, which means tea. And that's not even a Chinese or a Russian word. It's borrowed from Indian language, right? And then my students corrected me. They said, no, Ioulia, there's another word and it's tofu. I was like, oh, great. Now I have two. Fantastic. Like, where does that take me? Whereas with Spanish and English and Spanish and Russian and basically any other Indo-European language, that Latin base is 70% of your vocabulary. It's massive. So great. So you have a transfer. You think about how the two languages of a child relate to each other. So phonology really doesn't matter what the language is. If you know how to segment words into sounds and syllables and identify these in different parts of the word in one language, you can transfer that skill into the other language quite easily. Morphology, not so fast because you actually need to know the language specific units. If your language is a similar, great. If your languages are not similar, well, tough love. Go and learn them. Try learning that Chinese vocabulary. Woof. You kind of wish you were one again. That's hard. But now we're going to do something else. Well, now we're going to take a look at how these kids learn, how these kids read in English. So now never mind Chinese and never mind Spanish. This is year 2021, and they're all around in grade 3, and we test them in English. We test their English phonology, we test their English morphology, and we test their English word reading. That's the triangle. Remember sound, meaning, print? What's happening? Cool things are happening again. Turns out that the links between sound and word reading in the Spanish kids are way stronger than either in English monolinguals or Chinese bilinguals. And I'm not testing them in Spanish. Remember, this is English. Oh, I should start by saying the kids are identical in their word reading ability. So we match them. So it's not like the Spanish kids read worse. They have the exact same word and reading ability. They're matched because all of them started kindergarten at the same time. So all of them had the same amounts of English reading instruction. They're mostly in English-speaking environments. They're English dominant by the time we see them if they start kindergarten in English. So there's a grade 3. And Spanish-speaking kids have really strong sound to word reading association, stronger than the other groups. And then we look at morphology. And again, morphology, if you think about morphology, the tasks are kind of like this. Classroom, bedroom, mushroom. Which two go together, right? Classroom and bedroom have a room. Mushroom is not really a room. That's how you test morphological awareness if you haven't done that before. So the association with morphological awareness and word reading is really robust in the Chinese-speaking kids, more so than in either Spanish or the English, right? English. And again, I am telling you about their English reading. I'm not telling you about their Chinese reading. So even though I just told you that chai and tofu is all you got to transfer, nevertheless, remember in Chinese, words predominantly map onto characters. Those Chinese characters are morphemes. And the reason they do it is because every single word in Chinese has multiple morphemes. It's a complex language structure that is polymorphic, more so indifferently so than Indo-European languages. So the kids who speak Chinese, they kind of look for it. That's how they look for words. That's how they learn words. It's a different process. And so that process then influences the way they read in English. And those of you who know anything about middle school or like late elementary school reading, it's morphophonological, right? It's no longer segmentational decoding. It is morphophonological. So it's a really robust advanced literacy skill. It's a benefit. It's a terrific benefit that the Chinese language proficiency affords these kids with, is to be looking for these stable morphophonological chunks. So that's the story of the day. Every language influences English, right? No matter what language pair the kids are going to have. You can say, oh, Spanish is so similar, it's going to be great benefit for learning in English. I don't know what Arabic or Chinese are going to do here. Well, I'm telling you, both of these languages are actually heavily morphological. They have different orthographies, but they're heavily morphological in their structures, and they can transfer. Even though the vocabulary may not be the same, there's still ways in which there's a transfer, and it doesn't detract from English word reading. These kids are matched on their word reading ability, but it does boost certain elements of that process. So that is all in principle I was hoping to tell you today. The reason we get these findings is because as I keep emphasizing, when you hear me speak, I'm a native speaker of Russian. I speak English with an accent. So my brain was built on the basis of Russian. And then when English came in other languages, they're just using, right? The railroad tracks were built for Russian. And then the trains themselves can run through them, and they can be English and they can be Russian, they can be other languages. So things are kind of skewed in that way when I operate in English. For bilingual kids, those railroad tracks in their brains are being put together in collaboration by the two languages. And so they're learning slightly differently from the monolingual kids in each of their languages, but that difference does not deter, right? So each language brings something, it's like a potluck. They bring something to the table that is by and large beneficial, and there's joint work. So we call it the interactive dual language system, because we know they're in the same parts of the brain. You don't grow a third leg. You don't develop a third brain for another language. They're in the same parts of the brain. They're working together to do that build up. And some take-home messages are that bilingualism does not delay language literacy. Kids can combine, not confuse, but combine and transfer in their language skills in a way that is productive, no matter how similar or different the languages may appear to be. Encouraging heritage language use at home in the community is a benefit for all the points we mentioned earlier. If you're capable of giving L1 acid instruction, that's terrific. You don't have to speak Spanish, by the way. 70% of your English vocabulary has come from Latin, right? So if you just know that, if you're aware of your own English vocabulary and you're able to support kids in that way and aquatic, right? If you're able to grab onto these pieces and help the kids through that, you will gain by leaps and bounds in your instruction. And if you're able to give them language specific reading and speaking competencies, that's altogether terrific. So because the literacy skills combine across the two languages and thus benefit both languages. So with that, again, I remind folks, if you have kids who might be interested, your teachers or kids you might be tutoring who might be interested in participating with our work, please share that information. And with that, I thank Michigan, the Reading League, our funders, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, Michigan Dyslexia Branch, Ohio, Nobida has been, the Northern Ohio branch folks have been super helpful. But the bilingual schools that we work with throughout the state, and obviously our lab, and all of you for being here and participating. So I'll stop sharing so that you're not annoyed with my slides. I apologize, should have used a different screen.
Oh, no problem at all. I just wanted to make sure that they get that information. So folks, with the video, people have asked about the video. We will, you will find that on our Reading League Michigan YouTube channel that you can find through our website. And then I will send the recording to you, everyone who's registered, because I want to give you access to the information for the lab as well. And I have that flyer. If I can't find it right away, Dr. Kovelman, I will contact
And
you.
I will save the slides as a PDF and send them along so that then people can just look at them separately.
Lovely. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Kovelman?
I have a question. Okay.
Yes.
You had mentioned that there was no differences in the child who was signing in that first video, the little boy who was doing sign language and then speaking in French, and there was no differences in his benchmark. So I am like was really intrigued by that. They seem like they are completely different ways of communicating, yet they make benchmarks at the same time. I just wonder if you could add a little bit of information to this.
Of course, isn't this amazing that kids can, as you say, benchmarks, right? And there's lots of them because you think about older kids, it's going to be passives, complex relative clauses, right? They start with single words and then they go on to dual word combination, then the sky's the limit. Um, that is because the brain works to extract rules of language. And for as long as the information is provided, they will do it. It's a rule learning machine, right? We're born to talk. We're born to extract regularities from an input. The sun gets up in the morning, sets down at the end of the night. So if you provide those regularities systematically, consistently, in the two languages, in the three languages, they will go on and acquire them in the languages in which the input provide these regularities.
So you were saying we were born to talk, and I'm thinking about the sign language, and I want to ask this question then, we are born to talk, or is it more of we are born to communicate in this
We're born
case,
to have language. We're born
whether
to
it's
have
sign,
language, regardless of the modality,
and I've
regardless of
heard,
how that language comes in. It could be a sign language, it could be a spoken language, and there are systems of communication for kids who are deaf and blind, right? So these kinds of communications, we are born, these are regular, the brain doesn't hear. I don't know if that makes sense. The brain doesn't see and the brain doesn't hear. It's like the computer code 0111011, right? Because as I'm talking, the sound hits your cochlea, and your cochlea has nerve cell endings, and the nerve cell endings translate my sound into 0110s, right, and send them down the pipeline of the nerve, right? We call the auditory nerves that sends it to the brain, but that's what the brain perceives. It perceives that nervous impulse. So the same thing, the eyes are seeing information and the eyes are seeing these regularities. And the initial input is the nervous system of the optics, but it eventually comes out into the same parts of the brain. So the information, the regularities of language, whether they come through the ears or through the eyes or through the sensory modality, converge into the parts of the brain. We are born with the parts of the brain in the left hemisphere that sit and wait for these regularities.
so I need a new definition of language.
Language is amodal. It's not spoken and it's not heard and it's not tactile. It's everything. I can be clicking here, right? It just has to be it's the code. And the code has nouns, verbs, and object and adjectives, and it has 40 phonemes. And in sign languages, the phonemes are a hand shape and a hand movement, right? So this is an airplane and this is fly, right? So there's a hand shape and a hand movement, and they make a syllable. Syllable. There we go. So languages are universal in their structure. All the languages are universal. We have about 40 phonemes, be they spoken or signed. We have nouns, verbs, and objects. We have ways of denoting past and future tenses, right? All these relations are important for communication. And so it's like a code for as long as your brain gets the code, and it's universally organized in the brain. A deaf signer and a hearing speaking person neurologically look very similar.
I was going to ask you, does the brain fire the same way, whether you're doing sign language or spoken language or whatever
The
other?
the important parts, yes, the gram, right? The important parts are the sensory. No, obviously, we know if I close my eyes, I don't see anything, and if I plug my ears, I don't hear anything. So the sensory is different, but the languages you think about in terms of words and grammar and meaning and structure, these are the same. And if a person who is a deaf signer, right, we talked about Broca, and they have a stroke and it happens here, they lose grammar. They can still gesture, but they lose grammar. It's like if this happens to you, you can still, I don't know, sing and cry, but you cannot produce grammar.
Fascinating. I have a quick question too. If you can help me understand, I'm taking off my academic hat and putting on my grandma hat. And when my girls were little, we didn't know as much about teaching very young kids, like under a year old to sign, more and things like that. So explain to me how if they're really developing language the same way, whether it's spoken or gestures, is are we fooling ourselves into thinking they pick up on gestures earlier? Does my question make sense?
It does make sense. This is gesture is not language.
Okay. So when we're teaching them sign language and they're learning this, are
But
they
you're not
not
teaching them
necessarily
sign language. You're
connecting
teaching them
just a
gestures.
gesture? So we're
You're,
connecting meaning to just a gesture, but we're not building a language.
yeah, so if I know the words, oh, there we go. All of you now, two words in Chinese, unless you've taken more Chinese. All of you can say tofu and all of you can say cha. These are gestures. You can't say you speak Chinese because you don't have the prosody. Right. I don't say, when I say cha, and most Chinese speakers look at me and I actually have to point like at the tea or a teacup before, like, oh, it's like totally out of context and with the wrong prosodic markers and the tones are off, right? So that's what we do when we use signs out of context
Yeah.
without knowing the grammar and the prosody. Signers, if you're a second language learner of sign, you have an accent and they can tell you're not a native speaker, right? So it's all the same stuff. So yes, kids learn gestures and gestures support communication, but you're not teaching a child a sign language.
And I think that is the important thing to take away from me.
Right.
Like, I'm not teaching a child Spanish language if I teach them how to say mucho. Like,
Exactly.
teaching them a word, just like this is a word in sign language. Okay. Thank you.
Correct. You're welcome. Are there other questions?
Questions? Mary, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I've got another question. Since there are no delays then in the reading portion and in the talking portion, I'm wondering about writing
Well,
for
these are all
bilingual.
connected. These are all connected. So if you're providing instruction, then you should not be getting delays. I can tell you my kids can't spell in Russian for the life of me, but that's not because of the brain. That's because of, what some people call dyslexia, right? It's not dyslexia, it's dyslexia. They have a lovely Russian language tutor who comes to the house once a week, but that 1 hour a week does not provide the necessary volume of instruction to become a fluent writer or reader for that matter of Russian, right? So you guys understand that. It's hard. It's very hard, which is where I think a lot of these ideas come, is that the bilinguals never do as well as the monolinguals in either language. You really have to dig into, well, what's their experience in any of the languages? Because people assume it's the brain can't handle. They go, excuse me, what environment can provide? Like this perfect balanced, I don't know, well, King Charles maybe can, what is it, not King Charles anymore, what's his name, the Prince Andrew, right, and his kids who go to these fancy expensive bilingual schools, they can provide, but really, who can provide like this perfect multilingual education in a real world?
With that, I just want to pause and thank you for your time. And I want to add that Dr. Kovelman will be back. Oh, I have a slide. I can't remember the date. I want to say it's February 18th, but I'll add that also to my email with Rebecca Tolson, and they're going to explore more about, they're going to share more about morphology. So
Correct.
pretty exciting next step, and we appreciate you. We appreciate your, again, your brilliance, and it's just delightful how you make it really, for us practitioners, we can access the level of learning that maybe we've not had access to before. So I appreciate you, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for joining, especially so late on a Tuesday afternoon. Thank you for organizing, and good luck to you with your kids, your grandkids, and send me questions if you have any.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good evening and
Okay.
safe out there with this weather.